statistics and in-depth ethnographic approaches. And in this case, we look at using big data and small data sets to provide valid, thick, and richer descriptions of human behavior. I give this definition because when we start looking at what kind of papers we considered in this study, I think it's very, very important to understand the scope and the kind of studies that we looked at. So there is a lot of research, for example, that is looking at quantitative ethnography from very many different fields. But for this, we looked at the studies applying quantitative ethnography within the context of how Schaeffer actually defines this quantitative ethnography. So that should be noted. Why did we carry out this scoping review? The main purpose was to characterize and try to conceptualize the existing body of QE work and try to establish the boundaries of QE, where should QE be in order to develop the identity of the field. So this is an emerging field, and we feel like we need to understand the boundaries of QE, where it follows and where it starts from, and then identify some opportunities, challenges, and future directions of the QE approach. So the research questions. So we looked at 4 main areas. So first, we were looking at what are the key research areas where QE research is being applied. And then we looked at the research settings. Where is QE research employed? Is it in formal, non-formal, informal settings? And then looked at the theoretical approaches, or how studies employing QE are theoretically grounded, and what role does theory play in these studies? And then the methodological characteristics, which takes so many different aspects like the data and the analysis and the kind of approaches that are used in these studies. So those are the 4 kind of areas that we looked at in this research. So the methodology, so this is a scoping review. It's related to a systematic review, but the difference is that a scoping review is not as systematic as a typical systematic literature review. And the reason why we conducted the scoping review is that because this is a Are you able to see the slides? I think I saw.
We're just seeing the title slide right now, Rogers.
Only the title?
Yeah, only the title slide.
Oh, I think I can start sharing. I can try it again and see. Is it the same? Is it the same?
No, this looks good. I can see the other slides.
This is okay? Sorry?
Yes, go for it.
Okay, I'm sorry. So I just saw the chat, so I didn't know I was only showing. So so I talked about the purpose and then the research questions and then the methodology. So the methodology, as I said, we applied the definition of QE as defined by Schaeffer, and then we executed studies that are employing QE but not within this context. And then we included empirical studies and non-empirical studies. And in this case, we also didn't include studies like posters, for example. And then, but only research articles, and both in conference and journal articles. And we looked at research published between 2019 to 2019, when to March 20, this was 2020, sorry, I think this was a mistake. That's when we completed the search process, and studies were published in English. So the search process, I won't go into details because of time, but that's the structure of the search process. We looked at different databases, and finally, after the screening process, we ended up with 60 articles. So a quick overview of some of the results. We had studies, for example, we looked at the trend and publication and the sample size of the studies we looked at. So the 60 papers, we had conference papers, and then we had journal articles, and you could see like the biggest number of we had over 30 papers that are presented in conferences, and that's because we saw a very a higher kind of number of papers in 2019. That's because of the ICQE, the first conference that produced so many papers in QE. But also we had a range of papers that were in journal articles. And also, as you see with the regarding the sample size, the majority of studies were between 10 to 100 respondents or participants, and studies employing, for example, a sample of 100 to 1,000 being relatively small, with only 6, and those above 1,000 being only 1 study. So you can say relatively studies employing QE range between 10 to 100 respondents. Looking at the research areas, learning sciences is a predominant kind of area of research in QE so far, but also some other settings like health sciences and behavioral sciences are also kind of areas where QE research is being applied. Formal settings like university, K-12, and then informal settings like workplace learning environments and other simulations and other online environments were also dominant in the settings where this kind of where QE research is being conducted. Some of the methodological characteristics, which is a very key area of that we wanted to look at, because QE being a methodology, we wanted to see what is happening in this area. So data, we have data types, and we saw like data from online discussions dominated the kind of data used in QE, followed by interview data, then third-party data from third-party environments like gaming environments was also dominating, and then data from like audio and video settings was also available in some of the studies. So something that was key here is so like only 2 studies used observation, and this is something that was a bit surprising because having an ethnography kind of approach, we believe possible observation should be one of the approaches that should be used in QE studies to catch or to capture the ethnographic perspective. Of course, it's not the only approach, but I think we thought that this is something that can be picked up. Coding approaches, this is very important for QE because of the emphasis on validity, and coding is very important in doing so. And here we looked at different categories. We looked at the rating, the raters, data coding types, coding validation, and how data is coded. I'll summarize some of the key findings. Like for example, the raters, we realized that the majority of studies the majority of studies, for example, used 2 raters. That were like 26 studies using 2 raters, and then 10 studies used 2 raters plus machine, for example. So like you use 2 raters and then apply methods like encoder to analyze and interpret understand the different codes emerging from the data. But we also had some studies using 4 raters, and one used 9 raters. That was only 1 study. And then we had an approach like data coding. So when it came to data coding, how is data coded? And we realized that the manual process of coding data, which is like typical of doing grounded analysis, dominated the study, which was like 30% of the studies, which was 50% of all the studies used that approach. And then we had automatic coding, which had like 18 studies. Here they use like approaches like LDA to analyze or understand the different codes within the data. And 11 studies didn't report any information regarding the coding process. When it came to coding validation, so how to like validate the codes, here the main approach used, or the main tool we used, was Cohen's kappa, which was used in 30 studies, and Cohen's kappa with Schaeffer's rho was used by 9 articles, but 22 articles didn't mention anything about code validation, which according to our analysis was not something, is something to think about, because QE being so strict and very concerned about the coding process and the validation process, we thought this is something that needs to be captured. The coding type, whether it's top down or bottom up, most of the articles used the top-down approach. That was like 25 articles. That means they use predefined codes to capture or pick up relevant codes in the data. And then 18 articles used bottom-up approaches to analyze or to understand, to code their data sets. And no information was provided by 6 articles regarding how this process was done. Overall, 50% of the articles provided the information about the coding, but 50% of the articles never provided details about the coding approaches. which is an issue we think that is something that is really very, very important to capture by QE studies, since this is one of the key aspects that we consider for QE. When it comes to analysis, ENA, as expected, dominated the approaches used for analysis. And as you said, like all the studies at least used ENA in the analysis. And that was, but we also had 31 studies that used ENA only without combining it with anything else. But then others like 12 studies, for example, combine ENA with descriptive statistics and inferential statistics alongside other approaches like social network analysis and process mining. So that also tells us, yes, there's too much reliance of ENA during the analysis in QE studies, but also it's being combined by so many other approaches. And this is growing as more studies are coming up. The last part of the result was on the theory in QE. And here we realized that 36 studies at least used the theoretical framework, and 11 studies used some kind of disciplinary concepts to understand the data. But 16 studies were theoretical, meaning that they didn't apply any kind of theoretical framework or approach to understand the data. And what did they use the theories for? Mainly as a lens to interpret the findings. Others used it inductively to support the coding process, and some neither strictly deductive nor inductive. So some used them either to understand the codes and interpret their results, but also for coding purposes. So the summary of findings, as I summarize this, we can say there is a growing trend in QE studies that is depicted by increasing journal articles and conferences, and in journals and conferences, not only ICQE, but we see studies being published in different conferences like LAC and CSL, and then queries such as overwhelmingly associated with the learning sciences, and a number of data sources, but less non-textual sources. So much of the data is textual, with less textual sources like video, audio, and the data that is possibly audio is usually translated into textual data. ENA is dominant, and there is emphasis on validity, that is consistency between quantitative models and qualitative analysis, which is a promising trend towards the development of an identity of the QE community. Because one of the things we're looking at this study is how do we develop a kind of identity for this field. So, and then two main coding patterns, like Tourette has manually coding using bottom-up approach or top-down approach, and then validating with Cohen-Scapa, and then automatic coding using bottom-up or top-down, and then Tourette has using Schaeffer's or Schaeffer's Rho and Cohen-Scapa. So that was a pattern that we identified in the coding processes. And then most QE studies integrated theory, but also some didn't apply, which is a kind of something we need to be concerned about, because without theory, it's not easy to understand or interpret this data, and it actually interferes with the validation or the validity that we are trying to look at in QE. So the last slide is we felt like as a future research, as a new field trying to develop an identity, there are a couple of conceptual and methodological issues. And one thing we looked at was the overdominance of ENA at the expense of QE. We realized that in some studies, the word QE was not mentioned anywhere, but only ENA. And the question was, is ENA QE? So that's a very big question to ask. When we talk about QE, do we mean ENA? But from the studies we analyzed, it doesn't actually mean that, because there are a range of so many other tools that are coming up by different researchers. For example, look at other approaches like ROC, of course, that is used for analysis, and we looked at other approaches like the multimodal matrix by Buckingham-Shum and others. There are some other approaches like, of course, some other tools like Encoder Plus, and so there are a range of tools, and there are also studies that we see like in the current conference that are not reporting about ENA. So it's important to know that ENA is only a tool of analysis that's part of the toolkit of QE, but we should always remember that QE as a field is above the tool. So ENA is only a tool to support the analysis alongside others. And then we are yet to define standards, but that will indicate the identity of the field. But as I said, that the consistency in the way people use the consistency between quantitative and qualitative studies is one way that the field is trying to define its identity. and then attend to technical aspects such as attendability and interpretability, because some of the results are still presented in somehow a complex way. And if we are to achieve more kind of application of ICQE findings, we need some kind of tools that are easy and that are easy to understand, that could actually be able to be used to share findings with practitioners like teachers, possibly in real time. But overall, we feel like the strength of individual researchers and the quality of work that's being produced, and all the efforts like the International Society for Quantitative Ethnography present a powerful force to shape the QE community moving forward. So thank you so much. And I look forward to more discussion if there is anything you wish to discuss later. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rogers. Very important paper. There's a reason why literature reviews are always kind of one of those sought after papers, because of synthesize and definitely gems for the field. So we move into the next paper due to the time constraints, and I'm hoping that we will have some time for discussion. So our next paper, entitled Negotiating Tensions, a study of pre-service English as foreign language teachers' sense of identity within their community of practice, will be presented by Hazel Vega and co-authored with your colleagues from the University of Clemson. Hazel, 10+ minutes, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. So hi to everyone. So as you said, our paper is about identity, and I'm very happy to present this with my co-authors, my advisor, Goldman Sachs Support Irgens, and my dear colleague and friend, Cinnamon Sunrise Bailey. Okay, so we are talking about language teacher identity. That's the first concept that we have in our paper, and the way we are conceptualizing language teacher identity is from a sociocultural perspective. So we are acknowledging that identity has this dynamic nature, and that is socially constructed with others in interaction. This interaction also involves certain conflicts and tensions as individuals see what they expect for themselves, and what they assign for themselves, and what others also, roles that others assign to them. And of course, this process is always context bound, depends on the context and the situation. So we are exploring the discourse of native speaker and non-native speakers. So as you can see here, I have two figures. One is Anderson Cooper, who is a native speaker, a news anchor, and a non-native speaker who is a Latin American actress known for her very thick Spanish accent. And although this may seem a little bit exaggerated, this serves to represent the hierarchical dichotomy between the native speaker and the non-native speaker, and the native speaker being placed in this superior position. And why this is important in the context of English as a foreign language is that this is a pervasive ideology. And even though this comes from societal views, and even from depictions of media, that is still very present in conditions for hiring non-native speakers of English as teachers, for example. So what we were interested in looking at was the negotiations in these teachers' identities. So how they were making sense of this dominant discourse around native and non-native speakers, and also their perceived legitimate practices within their community of practice. So the framework that we used for this study was the Communities of Practice by Lev and Wenger, which conceptualized learning as a process of becoming, and that necessarily involves that development of identity. So participants, or in this case, these pre-service teachers in this language teacher program, they are considered to be newcomers to the community of practice, and they're seeking this central participation, which involves knowing the discourse, the values, the practices, and the meanings of that central participants, which are called all-timers. So in this transitional phase of becoming, they are involved in two processes. One is identification, which is aligning more their values and practices with those of the community, and negotiation, which gives them a room to choose what matters to them, and also shape and contribute to that community of practice. So we based our study on interview data with 4 pre-service teachers who were in the last stage of their teacher education program in Costa Rica. So they were studying to become English teachers, teachers of English as a foreign language in high school. The data analysis that we conducted was a mix between deductive and inductive coding, and of course, using the tool of epistemic network analysis. And this is a summary of the codes that, that we came up with. So we have more deductive categories, such as adoption and rejection, which come from the theoretical framework, but we also paid attention to those immersion codes, such as tension. And then based on these 3 codes, we started to see how they adopted, rejected, or manifested certain tensions around the codes of native speaker as a standard, accents, and legitimate practices. So what we found was that in general, the teacher education program, we conducted a little bit of document analysis, gives value to correctness among their pre-service teachers. And that correctness is most of the time reflected in expectations for non-accented English speaking. Also, we found that teachers, these pre-service teachers, were more frequently adopting than rejecting practices of their community of practice. So what adoption looked like is that, for instance, they considered that interaction with the native speaker was the best form of interaction and the best form of learning. So they were either thinking about ways in which they could include, for instance, native speakers as guest speakers in their own classrooms, or they had already done it in their teaching practicum experiences. They were also reflecting some rejection, particularly about the value of accents, and saying that accents should not be judged. But also, we noticed that there was this zone of tension and negotiation, particularly around the notions of the idealization of the native speaker, and also about personal reflections and accents. So the way this idealization, one way in which this idealization of the native speaker was reflected was, for instance, in thinking or saying that the way that native speakers learn in a native speaking environment is superior, or it places a lot of more advantages to the person who's learning. So for instance, this participant says, here in Costa Rica, you go from Spanish learning, which is a very natural way to learn a language, to a structured type of English. And to me, I don't see English that way. So what she was trying to say here, for instance, is that she considers the teaching of English in that foreign language context to be very structured, which means very focused on grammar and the rules of the language, as opposed to something more natural and something more social and authentic. In regards to personal reflections and accents, we noticed feelings of frustration, self-doubt, linguistic insecurity. So the way that they were reflecting this was, for instance, saying that they were frustrated because they could not attain that native-like accent that they wanted to attain. However, they had to remind themselves that what was important was communication, but they were in between these two concepts of, I feel frustrated, but again, I have to remind myself that it's okay. So our epistemic network analysis allowed us to make 2 different groups. And within these groups, we could go deeper into some of the codes that we found. So for instance, in group A, we were able to see that these participants, and these are 2 examples of the 4 networks that we have in our article. So we were able to see and really dig deeper into what it meant to what a native speaker as a standard really meant. So for instance, we were able to see that one of the participants reflected this in saying about the natural ways in which native speakers learn. And the other one was more comparing himself to the native speakers. So taking the native speaker as the benchmark. On the other hand, the other group, Group B, was more, tended more to make reflections and accents. So the way that these 2 participants reflected about that was saying, one was saying, for instance, that there is a difference, that there's a different expectations for teachers of English versus language learners in general. And the other one was more on the side of that frustration for attaining a native-like accent. But also what we were able to see through the ENAs was that these participants were making connections across the different codes, and particularly around adoption and rejection. There was always that central code of tension. So based on our analysis, we were able to reflect on the affordances for ENA, particularly for studies around identity development. So for us in this study, ENA was very useful in allowing us to test deductive categories that we had already established and really ground them in the data, and also look at those inductive categories and what they were telling us. And that's how this category of tension, which is very present in our data, that's how we found it, but we were also were able to ground it. And also this iteration and this interaction between qualitative data and those exploratory data visualizations that we were able to do at the beginning and throughout the process of data analysis really provided us with this view of maybe codes that were not, individually they didn't say a lot, but collectively they said a lot, and allowed us to find those patterns and create more broader categories, such as the native speaker as a standard. And the 2 groupings were very useful in providing those, as I said in the previous slide, in providing those more detailed insights into their identities and really looking at how they were looking at these discourses coming from their communities of practice. So more broadly, we can say that QE and ENA can be this very useful tool to identify similar processes of adoption, rejection, and tension that are part of the formation of identity. And this could be done, like in our case, in a formal environment, like in a teacher, in a language teacher program, but also it could be done in informal settings. And so this is my last slide, and I'll be very happy to hear any comments or questions at the end of the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Hazel. Yeah, great presentation, and reminded me of my time when I was a graduate student in Moscow University. I'm trying to teach pre-service teachers technical English, definitely. A lot of identity negotiation at that time. So we move in to the next presenter, and the paper entitled "Epistemic Frames and Political Discourse Modeling" will be presented by Eric Hamilton and his co-author Woodson Hobbs. But Eric, of course, will be the main presenter. Eric, please. You muted, Eric. Yeah. Mm-hmm. For some reason, I can't hear you.
Eric, you can try unplugging your headphones.
Any sound yet?
Yes, perfect. It works.
Well, perfection is my aim in life. My co-presenter Quinn Hobbs, Woodson Hobbs, is actually supposed to be. He's giving another session at this same time slot, so I'm thankful for that. And I also appreciate the first two papers, a lot of insight in each. And you are getting my screen share.
Dr. Hamilton, this is Quinn. I bounced back for you. So.
And there you are. So the topic today is epistemic frames and political discourse modeling, at least for this portion of the session. And the intention here is quite a bit different from the first two, but the idea is to see where ideas of QE and ENA can be expanded into other domains. In this case, we're looking at social media political discourse, and there already have been some papers in that area. The interest is to combine power from a QE approach with ENA and to apply it to an area that's affecting all of us. I call it a profoundly conflicted political era. The approach or the interest that we have in this paper is in part simply to see the degree to which we can mathematize. I know this is a blank screen, but we're looking at ways that we can mathematize discourse patterns. And so much of this conversation for the next few minutes is really on identifying the ethnography and then identifying what part of the ethnography can get converted into something to which ENA can be applied. And our approach has 4 components, and I'll use this as the primary staging area for the discussion. In this desire to produce an ethnography that can then be mathematized, we're using epistemic frame theory, and epistemic frame theory allows us to use an ENA coding system, and our focus of investigation will be on a construct we call discursive transactions, and a particular element of that, and I think the most important development, is the application of what we call emotional grammars. If I asked anyone in this community to define an epistemic frame that might apply to a political perspective, I think everyone would probably come up with something that is similar or not too far from the text I have at the bottom. Dynamic, multifaceted, evolving construct for an individual, how and why you bring certainty, moral commitment, identity around political perspectives. And what we've done in this, we especially want to integrate emotion or affect into the formation of political perspectives, which is actually fairly novel in the field of political theory. Trying to define an epistemic frame like that allows us to think about the evolution of a political frame and how it changes. And it also allows us to use codes. We are looking at political discourse in terms of text that appears with articles in Facebook or on Twitter. We're especially looking at some media outlets that we use for data in this paper, and we're looking at developing codes for acrimony or civility. If you look through any conversation thread that's in a political article, you'll see those two themes come up quite a bit, or those two characterizations come up quite a bit. To define the actual unit of analysis, we've come up with a construct that we call discursive transactions that have 5 phases. And this comes out of theories both of the integration of cognition and emotion and political theory. We treat input as an article that an individual might read, and then the cognitive appraisal process that then leads to an emotional generation or response that's developed. And that's the way that the individual adapts. In maybe more primitive language, emotion response or emotion generation is fight or flight, but in a political context and in political threads in social media, that would take the form of the argument that an individual would present. And that article, or I'm sorry, that response that would go into a political thread is what we would call the discourse contribution. The purpose of putting this entire array up is that the part that we mathematize is that final element, that discourse contribution. That's what we can look at, but it leverages and is defined by everything that precedes it. The input, the cognitive appraisal, the emotional generation, and the formation of a response. That then becomes a contribution that goes into a thread. So it's that final phase that's coded. And as you've or as I've been sharing, we're very interested in looking at how emotion comes into play, and in particular, defining a sequence of that's fairly invariant in terms of the nature of comments that are made and the nature of responses that are made. We're calling those emotional grammars. And in general, a theme or an observation is that current political media, social media, especially given time-constrained or character-constrained input, whether it's on Twitter or in a Facebook post or in a social or in a media outlet, those are very constrained, and it turns out to be an incredibly narrow pipe to process very complex emotions. And when individuals cannot process complex emotions, they overload the circuits, they overload the individual, and they then become distortions to that individual and to their epistemic frame. So you wind up having, from what we're calling emotional grammars, something of what's often called the internet outrage factory. We think it's important to try to understand and piece together how all this comes together. And the underlying idea or ununderlying idea behind this is that this whole sequence should be understood. The issues that divide people may not necessarily be the issues. In other words, the issue is not the issue. The issue is the emotion overload, the affect imbalance, the inability to process. And so you see, Vitaly asked me if I had any videos. I don't, but I have some references to videos. Some of you might remember how people changed in the movie The War of the Roses. Barbara and Olive Rose, picture perfect couple in a film in the late 20th century, and how their conversations started devolving until eventually they were fighting, and at the end of the movie they're hanging from a chandelier. A final gesture to try to save one another fails, and they wind up on the floor. And the idea is that who they were at the end is not who they were at the beginning. So understanding this and trying to use or mathematize the conversational may give some insight and prevent this kind of degradation. A last comment on this notion of people changing before I get into the mathematics of it, and my screen's taking up my time. Vitaly, do I have 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute?
I would say 3 minutes.
Okay, so to me, this is very serious. Many of you know that I spend a lot of time in Sub-Sahara, and this picture from the movie is people going from good to bad. Here's a picture from bad to good. Recently, I was at the Rwanda Genocide Museum, and this picture is a very mild one compared to what's actually in the Genocide Museum from 25 years ago. These are people just like anyone else who are certain of their views and wound up butchering one another over 100 days. It was one of the most avoidable crises in political history. This is what Kigali and Rwanda look like today. And my question is, what is it about the way we communicate that can help build sense and migrate people from one to another? So the process of mathematizing this comes down to breaking down what we call emotional grammars. I won't go through all of these. We'd like to come up with a set of maybe 20. Here are 6. I'll put, if you track social media and how people respond to one another, you will recognize some of these. And maybe the easiest one is number 2. You've attacked or insulted me. You're hostile to me. So I'll be hostile to you. Each of these represents some kind of logic basis that then elicits almost an invariant kind of response. And if one response elicits another invariantly, then the issue is not the issue. The issue is the grammar and how we're evolutionarily primed or organized to respond to one another. So looking at this, our next steps were to define a political epistemic frame. We looked at these different factors. Self and identity goes into the frame. We have a whole development around the epistemology of certainty. If I'm right, you must be wrong, which is an epistemologically incomplete way of organizing conceptualizations. If I'm right, you must not only be wrong, but you're morally bankrupt. And all those get wrapped up in emotional grammars that we've discussed in the paper. So we created a coding system that's based on those 4 factors to characterize utterances that appear in social media, and fell into these categories. We started out with a much larger group, and we came down to about 12 or 13. And from that, we applied a coding system to social media articles from the Miami Herald and the Chicago Tribune. We also used Politico and the Hill. For the paper, we just used the Tribune and the Herald, using data miner to scrape the data. Minimum of 100 comments. As you can imagine, and we can't get into in this session how to define a moving window, especially because there's multiple threading. You might have a comment here that applies to something far up here, and in the meantime, because it's all dynamic, you might have 2 or 3 conversations in the middle. We worked through those. We came up with what we considered to be a first pass of trying to mathematize comments according to the coding system that was developed from those emotional grammars. And we came up with a number of results. They're not surprising regarding acrimony, regarding anger and fear. The Miami Herald documents were a little bit more supportive of different points of view. The Tribune were not. That's just how those particular articles came out. And again, these are ideas and items that you can see in the article. So, and I don't want to shortchange those, but time doesn't permit. I will say that for final thoughts, we want to give more detail to the model and give some more examples, articulate norms for social discourse. In other words, different ways to think about and approach that media. Also looking at capital flows. Our social media are organized around algorithms to provoke hostility, to provoke disagreement, because that creates more eyeballs, which creates more money. There's enormous political incentive and capital incentive to create polarization. And then finally, we looked at, in the paper, you'll see several examples of places where we think that metaphors from the arts might be useful. A great line, and if we had the movie, I'd show it, from Crimson Tide at the end, or rather in the beginning. Denzel Washington says, in the nuclear world, the true enemy can't be destroyed. In my humble opinion, the true enemy is war itself. And in some ways, for us to understand dissonance is as much of an issue as the things that divide people. So there's a lot that's packed in here. I appreciate the opportunity to share. We both do, and not so much to delve into all the mathematics, but the overall idea of taking in or converting discourse into an ethnographic structure of this particular kind and mathematizing it using ENA to test whether or not the mathematization works and whether it can yield insight on the underlying ethnography. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Excellent work and extremely relevant and timely.
Thank you.
So since we have about 10 minutes and we have such rich papers, I want to open up the floor for the discussion and questions. And the idea that at least we have one question for each presenter. That's my goal. Yeah, please, Karen, go ahead.
So this is a question for Eric and Quinn. I noticed that you were interested in, you were looking at irony and sarcasm. As someone who works with teenagers, we're often faced with coding irony and sarcasm. Was this hand coding? Did you try machine coding?
All hand coding, Karen.
Yeah, that makes sense.
By the way, it was a blast to code some of that stuff.
I bet.
I actually did run it through encoder just out of curiosity to see how close it would come up, because there are some terms you can use to search for sarcasm, and it got pretty close. I mean, it wasn't as accurate as us, but I would say it probably missed maybe 30% of what we individually coded. But I was just curious because I was like, oh, I'm curious how well this works. So,
yeah, it's a great issue, and of course, coding humor is one of the hardest things you can do with something like encoder. And Quinn, I don't think I knew that you had run that through, and I'm amazed that you would get something like a 70% hit. So
it was shocking. I was very impressed. I did mention to you, but you were like, "Whoa, that's too much to think about right now." But it added another layer that we didn't need.
Good. So we have the next question from Jamie.
Yeah. So great presentations, everyone. I love to see a little bit of political topics. My question is around how you went about choosing the media sources for your data. So I think if I recall, you used The Hill and then started with an M. I can't remember now. And I think that those are pretty central on the political spectrum. And so how did that motivate your decision? And did you consider using media sources from more charged political
we did,
networks?
And I know Vitaly wants to get on to other talks, but very briefly, we did try to take something closer to the middle. We felt that was probably that was just an editorial decision for trying to do this initial mathematizing of the model. Good observation.
Yeah, I think it's important, right? Had you gathered information from CNN or Fox News or the Examiner, Inquirer, whatever, it might change your results quite drastically.
We definitely wanted to get discourse that was happening between both sides. So, we could actually go in and say, okay, this is a left to center comment. This is a right to center comment. And that made it more challenging, actually, I think, on the coding side in some respects. Because sometimes we're like, is this irony or sarcasm? Like, that's when it became difficult, as in some of those comments.
All right. Yeah. You're right. I encourage everybody to read this paper. I definitely enjoyed it. And yeah, definitely. There's so much opportunity for the multimodal data to judge the sarcasm or when you're missing this intonation. There's so much you can infer from the written text. But speaking of the other two presentations, first I want to ask the questions, whether we have the question from the audience for about the pre-service teacher's identity or the literature review. If not, I can ask a question at least to start with, and I have questions for both presenters. The first question for Rogers. Yesterday, Abby presented, our keynote speaker presented about the field of quantified ethnography, and definitely dominated by the learning sciences. And I'm curious, in your review, in your literature review, when you selected those 60 papers, so can you kind of confirm that indeed the context, the discipline, mostly in the learning sciences, or there's the second, the third place? I'm just curious in terms of the disciplinary distribution of QE research, body of research. Rogers?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think, as I mentioned in one of the slides, I think the results in this study confirm the same, because we realized out of the 60 studies, we had 53 studies from the learning sciences, and that was like looking at areas like engineering education, science education, teacher education, language learning. So that was the area where QE research is dominated. But also we found the rest of the studies, like 7 studies, 6 of them were within the health sciences, capturing topics like surgery and medicine, care transitions. And then we found 1 study within behavioral sciences. And just like you mentioned, of course, currently we see there is much concentration in the learning sciences, but possibly there will be a gradual shift as new other approaches come in. And as we saw in Helke's presentation, going into more political kind of discourse, I think that shows that there is some kind of shift towards other disciplines. But being a very new field, we can say you see the kind of most of the people driving the research, and those who have been working around this with this research are mainly from the learning sciences, and it's only shifting slowly towards other approaches. Yeah.
Thank you. We definitely need more ambassadors in the different fields and disciplines. Question for Hazel from the audience. I think Jenny, you raised the hand.
Yeah, I apologize. My question is actually for Rogers. So I was wondering if you might be able to define how you identified what exactly is a sample, because you had showed a distribution of the sample sizes of the studies that you pulled to be between 10 and 100. I assume, based on the fact that most of the studies are qualitative based, that a single sample would be considered a person. But how did you define that? How did you differentiate? Or is it just a charcuterie of different types of samples that you had quantified?
Yeah, thank you for that reflection. I think regarding the sample size, we looked at like in terms of participants. So we had, for example, studies where, if, for example, it's a MOOC, so it mentions this study maybe looked at data with 1,000 students or 2,000 students, and then this study was only looking at the DIADs, for example, like just small groups with 10 to 12 participants. But we also realized, I remember, maybe Camilla can come in if she remembers, that there were some studies that were not actually easy to categorize in terms of the sample size. So it was not clear what kind of sample they're actually using. Either they were silent about it, but for those which we reported, it was if they explicitly mentioned that this study, for example, gathered data from 200 or 3,000 participants were participating in this study. And it was also very common, for example, it's also very common in QE studies that, for example, you have a study with maybe 80 participants, but then the final kind of data that's analyzed is only for maybe 10 students or 12 participants. So that was also a very common aspect, but we always try to look at the final sample that was actually included in the final analysis, not the total population where the sample was collected. Yeah.
Beautiful. Hazel, and a question for you, kind of it's twofold question. Number one, have you kind of considered using epistemic frames theory? Because it is a formation, especially professional identity for the pre-service teachers. And the second, based on your insights and findings, what would you communicate back to the teachers, or what kind of changes could be made to the program once you know, kind of you reveal those patterns of how those pre-service teachers form their professional identities?
Yes. So no, we haven't considered using epistemic theory, and mostly because I think, and also with another intervention that we have made, we've taken more of that history perception of, you know, and defining identity more with the relationship of the person with the context and how that's structured through time and space and that contextual relationship. So part of that is the teacher education program on one hand, and on the other one is this history, because there's language learning requires this history. So we want to capture that, and I think we would, in further studies in my dissertation, we would have to incorporate other more theories coming more from anthropology, maybe to complement communities of practice. So the way I've actually sort of like communicated sort of these results with the program is that I went back and designed an intervention to work particularly around language teacher identity, and that's another step in my dissertation. And I did it through participatory research methods. So I worked with a professor developing that intervention, hopefully that it's sustainable for the program as well.
Beautiful. And so I want to keep everybody on time. So it's at least 12 o'clock here in Ann Arbor. I'm not sure it's different time. So wherever you are right now. So thank you so much. Great presentations. I encourage everyone to read the papers.